Welcome back to the Counter Narrative, where we shine light on crucial issues shaping our society. I am Rihanot and I'm here with the incredible Tiaraoluwa Oluwabukumi Fade.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Counter Narrative. And today we have the incredible opportunity to speak with Dr. Lisa Sugiura, Associate Professor in Cybercrime and Gender at the University of Portsmouth. Lisa is an internationally recognized expert on online gender-based violence and technology-facilitated sexual violence.
Through her extensive research and publications, Dr. Sugiura has delved into the language of cybersexism, the incel community, online misogyny, and so much more. It's an honor to have you on the podcast. Hello.
Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
It's nice to have you. So we'll just go straight into the interview without any further ado. So could you start by addressing some common misconceptions about women and the incel community and manosphere that are not backed by evidence?
Okay, so in general, if we're talking about incels and the manosphere, there's an overriding sense that women are somehow born evil. Just that they are the reason they're the reason for all of men's problems in our societies. And the reason they believe this is in a sort of warped sense of their misappropriation of biological essentialism and evolutionary psychology theories. So even though you kind of think, well, that's scientific subjects, right? Psychology and biology. What they've done is take theories that have actually been debunked and are proven as sexism anyway, and then they've kind of made it fit their own narratives. So the reason that they think that women are born evil is the sense that women are somehow driven by looks, and they will only choose to mate with men who are the most conventionally attractive in our societies. Money does feature in, but looks will always be the most important thing to women. And so the sorts of theories that they throw about in these incel communities and the broader manosphere are based on things like the notion of hypergamy, where they believe that women will always marry up. And in this sense, again, it's based on marrying or having sexual relations with men who are better looking than them. And what they've done is misappropriate that from the Indian caste system about families expecting their daughters to marry men who are from a richer status. In general, they believe in something called lookism. And again, it's all about how attractive you are and how successful, both romantically but also societally, you will be in life if you are more attractive, basically. And they say that it is only women that are driven by looks, that somehow men and other persons do not have those same values, which seems a little bit reductive. And they believe in things like the kind of misappropriation of the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, that 80% of women will go for the 20% of best looking men, which means that then the ugly men don't have anybody to have romantic and sexual relations with. So essentially, it's that it's all basically presenting women in this very narrow fashion, that they're purely driven by looks and status. And then in turn as well, what they're doing is kind of just reinforcing the notion that women's only value is in their looks and their sexual availability as well.
Wow, those are, and we see this on social media all the time when people talk about, oh yes, women always marry up, women always do this, like it's what they actually think, and a lot of them use that to behave in real life. So yes, thank you for clearing those misconceptions up.
Writing the incel rebellion must have been challenging, especially as a feminist engaging with women haters. Could you share your experience and the precautions you took for your safety?
Yes, it was a difficult topic to research, a difficult research space to be in, and the fact that I'm a woman and I identify as a feminist. I'm very open about that. Obviously, researching misogynists, essentially men who openly hate women, was obviously a difficult place to be. I have to be honest and say that when I went into the research, I was probably a bit naive, even complacent, because I thought, oh, I'm a criminologist. I've been working in the kind of field of gender-based violence, sexual violence, things that are not very nice. That I thought I'm strong. I'm strong enough to kind of cope with this, and I didn't necessarily take enough precautions in regard to my emotional well-being. I was better prepared in regard to kind of external risks, so things about cybersecurity, for example, where I thought, if I'm going to be openly saying I'm researching this space, I interviewed incels, for example. They know who I am. I thought I had to make sure that my identity was protected online, so I would check the privacy settings on all of my social media accounts. I would try to make sure that my professional accounts were very separate from my personal. It's not just myself I have to think about. I have to think about my family and friends as well. I don't want to expose them to any risks. So basically there's lots of Google searches on myself to see what was available, basically what they could find out about me, and then try and hide anything that I didn't want anybody to find out about me. So I was good in that respect. But then when it comes to the emotional labour of working in this space, as I said, I was probably a bit more naive, and I didn't have a plan in place to protect me from trauma and vicarious trauma. And I would spend hours, days, weeks, and this was during lockdown, during the pandemic as well. So I would spend just ages immersed in these, in these incel websites and forums, just reading, really horrible stuff about women, racism and homophobia and ableism, and there's also a lot of commentary about mental health and suicide ideation. And so I'm immersed in those spaces without taking proper breaks, without having time to decompress and come away. And then of course I'm speaking with incels as well about their experiences and about their pretty hateful worldviews, and it did take a toll on me, and I found myself becoming a little bit I don't want to say completely fatalistic, but a bit despondent about the world. What's the point? Everything's just horrible, and thought, oh no, I need to step back now. I kind of realised that I needed to set better boundaries around myself and my own well-being, working on this topic.
Oh, wow. I can't imagine having to go through all of that to do a research. I can imagine the kind of mental toll it would have taken on you. How are you able to deal with the mental stress?
So I'm saying that I'm much better now, because I kind of realised I need to compartmentalise better. I need to do things that take me away from the research and remind me, that the world is nice and not everybody's horrible. And also the bigger picture, why I do this work. So why do I do this work? Because I want to make a change. I want to tackle inequality and gender-based violence, and so it's reminding myself of that motivation, that this is worth it. But watching TV and films that had nothing to do with this subject, which wasn't always easy, because obviously these sorts of subjects are very sensationalized in the media, aren't they? But things like walking my dogs and coming away and listening to music and meeting up with friends, but also being able to speak with people as well, other people that research in this space, to share those experiences and realize that you're not alone, is that solidarity, I think, is really important.
Thank you for that answer, and also was so sorry about all you had to go through to do this. Was so sorry about it.
Absolutely fine.
Also, building up on that, could you tell us about the incel community? A lot of people are probably hearing this for the first time. What does it mean? What does the manosphere mean? And what were you able to find Yeah, what were you able to find out when you did the research and studies on them? What were your findings about the community?
Okay, so it's quite a lot. I'll kind of start at the beginning. So I start with the manosphere. Okay, so the manosphere, it's a name that has been given to particular spaces online where men congregate to talk about issues that are affecting them. The term was created by Ian Ironwood, who wrote a book about the manosphere, A New Hope for Masculinity. He was a former person working in the pornography industry, so essentially, what if we kind of think practically what the manosphere is, it's forums, blogs, videos, where, as I said, where they're kind of talking about men's issues, but most of the time it is a way for men to vent the frustrations about women and feminism, and to kind of take that victim narrative to kind of say, oh, that actually, despite all the evidence about violence against women in our societies, it's actually men who are the real victims and they need to fight back. And so within the manosphere, we've seen these groups form, and they've kind of taken these different names, and they might have slightly different agendas driving them, but they are all united by that sort of anti-feminist stance. And they also draw on the film The Matrix, where they believe that you can take a red pill or a blue pill. There are other forms of pills as well, and it can get all complicated and messy. But they say that from the film The Matrix, the red pill or the blue pill, well, the blue pill is you can just stay in the kind of fantasy land where you're completely naive and you think the world's all wonderful, and you believe that that women are the victims of sexual violence and feminism is a good thing. Whereas if you take the red pill, you kind of wake up to the so-called, what they believe, the reality of the world, where feminism is ruining everything. Women are born evil, and that actually a way to kind of improve our societies is to go back to the kind of traditional gendered kind of roles. Men are the breadwinners, women should just stay home and have babies, and women should be subservient to men. That's a kind of overarching ideology. And as I said, there are different groups within them. You've got men's rights activists, and they are most linked with the men's rights movement that was physically active in the sort of 1970s, support and kind of grew out of the initial men's liberation movement that supported second wave feminism and still does today. This is kind of ally of feminism. But you had this splintering into the men's rights movement, which basically wanted to tackle any form of gendered rights progression. So any kind of moves that feminism and gains that feminism made in regards to things like tackling domestic abuse and violence and creating women's only shelters and legislation tackling these things like against marital rape and abortion and things like that. They are campaigning against those things. And the men's rights activists are also more likely to have that presence offline. They are campaigning offline, and we'll see them in physical demonstrations. Then you'll have pickup artists, and this kind of group evolved more from the sort of mid-2000s self-help movement, particularly around Neil Strauss's The Game, and it's all about those techniques and tricks to fool women into having sex with men. Basically, women are just mere bodies to be tricked into having sex. And the kind of ideas of the pickup artists still remain pretty prevalent. They're still quite strong today, but you kind of see the crossover with the incels that I'll speak more about in a moment, where they're kind of, how can we get women to have sex with men, basically. And incels are the kind of aggrieved men that those tips and techniques are not working for them. So they kind of become more involved in the incel ideology. They also get the men going their own way, or MGTOW for short, and they just believe having absolutely nothing to do with women is the way forward. A world without women is better in their eyes completely. but contradictingly, many of them are married, and of course, they must have relations with women. They must have some interaction with women, in their jobs or life in general. So there's always things that undermine. Obviously, been a lot of attention on the so-called incel community. So for those of you that don't know what incels actually are, the term stands for involuntary celibate. It is a self-defined term by those who believe that they are unsuccessful in obtaining sexual or romantic relationships with those that they desire. Originally, the term was created back in the sort of mid 1990s online as part of the so-called involuntary celibate project. It was by a queer Canadian student named Alana, who set this up for like-minded people who were lonely, people who were struggling to find romance, and it was gender inclusive. It was a supportive space. But over the years, and particularly as Alana moved away from like moderating that community online, the name in particular has been taken over predominantly by aggrieved men, by men with misogynistic tendencies. And even though there are some who still align with that gender inclusive term of incel, the term now has been foremost associated with the kind of misogynistic incel community. And I think it's really important that we make that differentiation and say misogynistic incels rather than just incels per se, and avoid homogenizing. And I think if we use that term misogynistic incel or incels, we realize how that is connected to broader structures of societal misogyny and male supremacism. And we don't risk kind of, say, targeting or tarnishing everybody with that kind of same sort of problem. What we're talking about here is the hateful actions of those misogynistic incels as well. And I think the reason they've obviously got so much attention over the past few years is how they've been increasingly linked to some really awful and tragic cases of mass violence, mass murder and attacks, predominantly in the US and Canada, linked with a case in the UK as well. But I think it's really important to understand them as one form, albeit a very extreme, exaggerated form of misogyny, and not see them as something isolated and kind of kept different online. They are like one of the more kind of contemporary iterations of misogyny. They're not something novel.
Well, that's interesting. And I'd like to ask: are there women in the incel communities? And if there are, how are they treated in the community? How are they viewed?
Yeah, so as I said, there's that kind of, it was originally gender inclusive for anybody, irrespective of sexual orientation, gender identity. Yes, there are women and they ordinarily identify themselves as femcells. For those misogynistic incels, they don't think women could ever be an incel because they believe women have all the sexual power, that they will always find a man who will sleep with them, irrespective of whether or not they are deemed to be conventionally attractive or conventionally attractive to incels. So they think, for a woman to be involuntary celibate is not a thing. And so obviously, along with all the hatred and derision of how they think about women, the misogynistic incels would not allow them on their spaces, and the really, the more hateful places will say that in the terms and conditions. There's almost like a way to prove that you are able to be part of that community. They are really not allowed, and obviously in the way that they speak and behave towards women, it's quite clear that women are not safe. Women are not meant to be in those places. But in regards to femcells, as I said, there are spaces that are more, sort of aligned with that gender inclusive form of incel, and women might be part of that. But you also get dedicated femcell places, and I'm not saying that it's completely healthy, because they do align with some of the, the kind of fatalistic views that their situation is immutable. They can't, they're forever going to be lonely, and there is talk again of mental health and and suicide ideation, and of course that's really awful and problematic. But they've not been linked with any broader forms of violence. Certainly haven't engaged in physical forms of offline violence that we know of. And so, I think obviously we're really seeing that kind of threat that's coming from the misogynistic male incels.
Oh wow, that's interesting, really, seeing women in spaces that are so misogynistic like that. And like you mentioned that it was Alana, who was a woman, a queer woman, who started the movement, and then the misogynistic men took over it, and now they are basically not even allowing women in the space. It's really, it's ironic, really.
I think it replicates the early kind of ideas of being online anyway. That when we, the development of like 4chan and Reddit and things like that, they would regularly put things like, not for the internet is not for girls and things like that. This is what we're seeing is like those male only spaces. Women are not welcome. We've had that offline, obviously, for generations, haven't we? And it's almost like the internet, and of course the links with technology and male dominance not really being very inclusive and representative and diverse. That this is still in favor of white cis het able-bodied men, and anybody that doesn't fit that hegemony then is not welcome.
Oh wow. Thank you for shedding light on that. So you mentioned the fact that the incel community has a connection with fatality and how they view life. Is there also a connection with heterosexual pornography? Is there a connection between incel culture and heterosexual pornography?
So it would be difficult to kind of, they don't really talk a lot about, for example, pornography consumption on the spaces that I engaged with anyway. And I suppose it's quite difficult to kind of see, to what extent pornography would make being would affect being an incel, if it makes them an incel or whatever. But what we do know in evidence is the impact that pornography is having on our societies, and particularly younger people, and their understanding of sexual relations and their expectations as well of how to act. And of course, so much within the pornography industry is pretty dehumanizing to women and misogynistic. And so a colleague and I, we did a study where we compared the language in violent pornography with that within the misogynistic incel community. And it's this isn't about saying either pornography or incels created misogyny. Rather, they're both tools within this. And we saw that there were many overlaps. So incels have created their own kind of special language, and they've made up all these pretty denigrating words for women and things. And what we see is that some of that has been borrowed from terms within pornography. So we can absolutely see that kind of overlap and influence, which I would say I don't think is just unique to incels. I think we have that the influence of violent pornography, which is actually arguably mainstream pornography. It's what is readily available now. We don't have to go looking for specialized places, on the sort of readily available, free, easily accessible, mainstream, big name pornography websites. It's quite violent straight away, and I think that has an influence throughout society, not just on specialized misogynistic communities.
Yes, the fact that you mentioned the violence bit is very important, because you see that incels get off on the idea of violence against women, and we see that a lot of mainstream pornography is mostly centered around violence against women.
Yeah.
So it's yes. So yes,
And that's why so many people do not see marital rape as a crime because, oh, I own you. They want to dominate so violently on their wives or on their partner. And this brings me to my next question. In your book, you discuss the role of digital technology in spreading violence and hatred against women. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, so I think it's important to say that, technology is not created violence against women. Obviously pre-exists and continues to coexist alongside it. But what it does is it reinforces those existing structural inequalities and abuses that are in our societies. They've always been in our societies. But it amplifies them. It makes them worse. It exacerbates the harms to people, and it creates, considering for most people now, we live our lives on and offline ubiquitously. It's there's no separate on. It's not like we suddenly press pause on our lives when we go online. We live our lives on and through technology. It's just embedded with everything we do, and so when abuses happen, it is happening to people, and it can happen on a much larger scale. So when it comes to things like the online harassment, things like the rape and the death threats and the doxing, which is the release of your personal information, there's the permanence of it. You don't know, where it's online, how long has it been online? It'll stay online forever, perhaps. People have shared your intimate images. Where have they gone to? When there's forms of networked harassment, and you think of the audience and the reach of other people getting involved as well. So it becomes like one person saying something horrible to then thousands and thousands of people all getting involved, and you can feel like you can never escape that as well. And then when you see a really kind of key tactic of this form of abuse as well is like rage farming, where they'll like target people usually from like marginalized communities and try and get them banned, so there's another form of silencing of people. It's what it is doing is absolutely amplifying existing societal problems.
Oh wow! Yes, that is a very important point that you made about how gender-based violence did not start with digital means; it's just been amplified. So we know that there are several kinds of online-based gender violence. Could you name some of them? There's several forms. So could you name some of them and how women and girls can stay safe online so that they do not have to be victims of this crime?
I don't want to say that this is an exhaustive list. I think this is huge, and I think many of the forms of gender-based violence are being reproduced through digital means, and I think there's so many different forms, but some of the key things, are things like the image-based sexual abuse. Sometimes that's referred to as revenge pornography, although I feel that term denies and minimizes the harms that victims are experiencing. But often women are targeted by virtue of being women, because there is that gendered element to it, and it's about obviously access to women's bodies and shame and the humiliation of the public kind of consumption of women's bodies. There's obviously things like there's harassment. As a part of that, you get doxing, where it says the release of personal information, rape threats and threats for sexual violence, which often accompany that. There's stalking is obviously a huge gendered issue, and that can coalesce with offline forms of stalking as well, obviously depending on where the perpetrator and the victims are based. But the technology kind of enables abusers to kind of be able to have this almost omnipresent kind of way of being in the victim's life. They feel that they can never escape because they're accessing absolutely everything as well. Going back to things like harassment and abuse, sometimes perpetrators are setting up things like fake accounts in the victim's name to kind of ruin their reputation. and things like that. But I think essentially what I'd want to kind of just reiterate is that, say that a lot of this is replicating other forms of gender-based violence that have been in existence as well. And in terms of how we can try and sort of protect ourselves against this, I mean, I want to be kind of cautious about sounding like I'm responsibilizing victims and survivors too much. Yes, there's obviously things we can do to try and stay safe, but it is always the fault of the abusers. I would never want to say that, if you didn't do something online, that that somehow it's your fault. It is never the victim's fault. But I mean, I suppose it's basic kind of cybersecurity kind of hygiene measures you can put in place, like your privacy settings, and how much you've got out there about yourself, so people can't find out much about your identity, and obviously to try and minimize the risks of things like stalking, things like the image-based sexual abuse. I mean, it's a difficult one, because again, I don't want to sound like I'm judging, and within the context of a healthy relationship and sharing images and things, I'm not going to make any judgments, but it's about obviously just being mindful about those risks. But of course, the thing is nowadays as well, that even if you don't take pictures and you don't share pictures, we have deep fake technology now, which is so sophisticated that even if even if you don't take pictures, that it can be created about you. But I think so. It's kind of trying to be safer online. But as I said, it's never ever the victim's fault. So I think what we should be doing is switching the focus onto who else is responsible. It's always the abuser's fault, and also look to things like social media companies and the tech companies and the platforms to protect people, particularly people who are more vulnerable online more.
Yes, thank you very much for making it very obvious that it is never the victim's fault. We have to shift our conversation, the focus on the perpetrators instead of the victims, because it is never their fault. So thank you very much for that.
I mean, we have so many victims blaming themselves. They could say, oh, it was because of this thing that I said that I got punched in the face. And no matter how much you try to explain that, it wasn't because of what you said. Yeah. It is the perpetrator's fault for even hitting you in the first place. And that way,
absolutely,
just maybe so many victims are able to speak up on the issues of abuse and all forms of violence. And, with the global rollback on women's rights, from the overturning of Roe versus Wade to the increase in femicide, what do you think is the driving force against this war on women?
I mean, I think whenever there's progression, particularly in regards to rights of communities that have been marginalised, there does always seem to be a backlash, and I think there's a particular climate at the moment, and I'm going to get political. I think the rise of the far right, I think, is really kind of driving an agenda here, where they have tapped into insecurities within societies, and is saying that somehow we need to return to this traditional age, and that will solve, economic problems. That's going to solve all of these issues, and people believing that. And I think there are, in particular, when it comes to the kind of war on gender and the war on women and feminism, I think there's three really key components, and I think the first is the fact that we have never tackled structural misogyny. It's there, it is in us, it's embedded in our societies, and I think the kind of the post-feminist kind of response that, women can vote. Can they all around the world? Women can do this and women can do that. And it's like, yeah, but we're not there. We're not in an equal society. And I think the fact that obviously that remains means that that's obviously going to be something that we still have to contend with. And as I said, there's that backlash to progression. And I think over the past maybe 10, 15 years, there's been a lot of activism. I think particularly with like maybe more intersectional fourth wave feminism, things like Me Too, which I appreciate, was, kind of taken over by Hollywood, but was a movement that was in existence a long time before that. But, that kind of more recognition about tackling sexual violence, and particularly male violence and aggression, against women. Lots and lots of conversations about that, which then has been used, to kind of say that this is somehow a war on men, and so playing into that victim narrative. And then I think actually, thirdly, it's not to say that men don't have very real problems, because they absolutely do. I think, there are, men struggle with mental health as much. And in the UK, suicide rates for men are really, really high. And it's all to do with the kind of, the compartmentalization of gendered stereotypes, and men feeling that they have to play up to these rigid roles of masculinities, and it's I think, and then instead of tackling that and recognizing that, it's easy to kind of look at women, it's easy to look at others and say, oh, that's the problem, rather than actually say internal issues about masculinities. And I think all of that is creating this perfect storm, which, as I said, is being weaponized by the far right, and not even the far right sometimes, because you get obviously pretty prominent people in positions in the mainstream that are reinforcing many of these narratives as well for their own purposes, because they know it's going to get them elected, it's going to keep them in power, it's going to get their support, and I think there's a real there's a real problem at the moment.
Okay, so thank you for the answer. So basically what you're saying is that the war against women's rights and women is as a response to women wanting more rights, or for women being enlightened and wanting more from a patriarchal society. Is that correct?
Yeah, and actually, I mean, that is in terms of like incel communities as well. They will regularly say that what caused them to become incel, or what creates an incel, is the fact that women have more rights. If women didn't have agency and autonomy over their bodies to choose their sexual partners, then they would be sleeping with incels, basically, or actually, incels would be raping them, right? Basically, because that's what they're advocating for. But because things like, so you mentioned marital rape and things like that, that is now, that's recognized as an offense, thank God, right? It's, they say, well, ordinarily a man would, have property, the woman would be his property and things like that. So yes, that is that backlash to gendered rights progression.
Oh, all right. Thank you very much. So do you see a solution in the nearest future? Can you see, like, from your studies, from your research, do you see a solution to this war against women and women's rights in the nearest future?
Yeah, so I think we have to remain positive, because otherwise why would we do this work? It would just become all consuming. But I think it's from all aspects. It's an all societal response. Basically, we need to obviously work better in terms of education and educating younger children about gender equality, about these subjects, obviously in a way that is appropriate for their age, but we need to start dismantling these toxic ideas from a young age. So obviously schools and educators have a huge role to play in this, and parents as well. Obviously a lot. There's a lot of influence from the home, and then as I said, with tech companies, I think often tech companies, they're driven by profit. They're not driven by user safety. And so in terms of holding tech companies accountable for harms that are hosted on their platforms, then they're actually they're gonna be more compelled to do something about it. In the UK, we've got recent legislation, the Online Safety Act, which there's lots of room for improvement within it, but they do include women and girls. They do recognise that women and girls are more vulnerable to certain harms online, and so there is a duty now on the regulator to kind of have a code of conduct about how to protect women and girls better. So obviously more work needs to be done in that area. But even when it comes to tech design, often tech design is not done, again, with user safety in mind, in particular, well, those people that really need to be protected, people that are already most vulnerable in our societies, and having more diversity in that process, because the tech industry is notoriously not diverse. So you want to hear the voices of people that are going to be, that will be affected if the tech isn't secure. But I think as well, it's not just all about the tech, because no matter how secure you try and make it, you can't design out misogyny, racism, homophobia. All of those things are still going to be in society. So this is a real cultural issue as well. And obviously that is not a quick fix. That's going to take time. But with all of those other things, all of those other components, then we start to chip away at these problems, at these structural problems, and we try and dismantle those institutions. But it's going to take time, but I do have hope that future generations can, if we keep on doing this, we can make a more inclusive, equal, safer world for everybody.
And I'm joining my hope with yours, because I don't want to be pessimistic. When you look at the world and you see the situation of things, there's a need. Sometimes you feel like, oh my God, there's no hope and all of that. Yeah. But yes, I'm joining my hope with yours that in the nearest future we'll have girls and women who grow up in a safer world and safer online community.
Because it feels like the more we fight, the more they fight back. Yes. So it's like we're not getting anywhere.
I know, and it can just feel so overwhelming and demoralising. But actually, I think I can't remember if I've probably read this somewhere or somebody has said this to me. But it's a sign, though. It's a sign that we are making a difference. That backlash, that reaction is because the change is happening, and people don't like it. So they're pushing back against you. If it was no impact from it, then there wouldn't be a reaction. So as hard as it is, and we absolutely don't deserve the backlash. Obviously we don't. But it's that, I think there's that kind of positive to kind of take from it, that we are doing something. We are making that difference.
Yes,
I completely agree. And lastly, could you offer our listeners some advice on staying safe online and protecting themselves from incel indoctrines and violence against women?
Okay. So a couple of things. I would think, it's about amplifying women's voices, right? It's about listen to women, support women, be, just kind of be more critically minded about what is online as well. So much of what is presented seems to be, evidentially based, and it's not, is pseudoscience, and it is obviously really hateful and discriminatory. So just kind of think about the sources. Where are the sources that you were presented with coming from? And kind of think about, if there's a bigger agenda here at play. And as I say, just, kind of hold true to your values as well. What about, again, what sort of world do you actually want to live in? What sort of person do you want to be, And I think just kind of, stay true to that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lisa. Thank you for sharing your invaluable insight and research with us. Thank you so very much.
And also, I want to mention what you said about checking facts, fact-checking, staying true to your values, because people come online and they just bring up stuff about things that are not even true, pseudoscience, they present them as fact. So, and that's what we do on the podcast. What we do is that we counter those things. We see a lot of people post things that are not true, but they sound possible.
And they have an audience that believes what they're saying. Yes.
So what we do is that we look for data, we look for science, we look for research that actually does not back any, like when they say things like, oh, women are less intelligent. There's no data, there's no science to back that up. Yes, so what we do is that we actually look Yes, we look for. So thank you for that very important thing, because when you're online, you can be bamboozled and you just take anything you see. So it's important to always to dig deep to find the truth before taking things in. So thank you very much for that tip on how to stay safe online. And to our listeners, we hope this episode has provided you with a deep understanding of the challenges and threats women face online and in society. And remember that awareness and education are key in fighting against gender-based violence, both online and offline.
Stay informed, stay vigilant, and continue to support one another. Do not forget to subscribe to the Counter Narrative podcast for more enlightening discussion. Thank you so much.
And you can follow us on social media. On Instagram, we're at the Counter Narrative Podcast, and on Twitter at the CN_podcast, and on TikTok at the Counter Narrative Podcast. Make sure you subscribe, you listen, and you share with your friends. Thank you, and see you next time.
Bye.